Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. We're right back in the mix of our top-tier U.S. Senate race on this Sunday. In Republican primaries going back several elections now, a Trump endorsement has been the gold standard. One candidate has it in New Hampshire this cycle, and it is former U.S. Senator John Sununu, who joins us this morning in studio. Senator, thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Speaking of President Trump, we just had a State of the Union, and interestingly, there was some, theater, I guess, that went on there with him sort of asking people to stand in favor of U.S. citizens over illegal immigrants. Congressman Pappas, your potential opponent in November, says he didn't stand, says it was a gotcha. What are your thoughts?
Look, the State of the Union is political theater, but that doesn't change the fact that when you're asked if you put the economic well-being and the security of American citizens over someone who broke the law and came here illegally, you've got to stand up. You've got to say yes. And the reason you put the Americans first is because you've got to put New Hampshire first. And you've got to believe in that. And look, what really bothers me is the reasoning behind that. He just went along with the crowd. He just went along with the liberal left, following them instead of doing what's right. And when I announced my campaign, I said, look, got one job. One job. Stand up for New Hampshire every day. And when you're not willing to put American citizens above those who have broken the law and come here illegally first, you're never going to put New Hampshire first.
Congressman Pappas, like we noted, is the potential opponent in November. He hasn't lost a race here in New Hampshire since 2010 when he was running for Hillsborough County Commissioner. You've dinged him already on the voting with Nancy Pelosi 99% of the time, sticking to his party too much. Those attacks have been used before. They haven't worked. People have talked about him being a big spender, bad at immigration, not supportive enough of police. All of it has not stuck so far. So how do you defeat a Democrat who has proven impervious to these attacks in the past?
Well, look, I'm not going to lay out my entire campaign strategy here for you or for him or for anyone else, but let me point out a couple of things. One, it hasn't been 99% of the time. When Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, he voted with her 222 out of 223 possible times. That's a lot more than 99%. The second, and you're talking about 2010 or 12 or 14, that's not today, right? That's not what we're dealing with today. And lastly, this is about the United States Senate. It's about the future, 6 years, the voice we're going to have representing New Hampshire in Washington. Obviously, President Trump's going to be president for the next 2 years. I know I'll be a far more effective advocate with the White House, with this administration than Chris Pappas ever could be. But it's also about what comes next. Where does the country go? Who are the next leaders? The issues we deal with, the tone, the temperament. Where do we take the country? And I know that I have the experience and the background to help take the country in the right direction.
You're looking to the future a little bit, but you have President Trump's support now. If he comes here to do a big rally, are you going to campaign alongside him?
Look, the president's support is welcome if he's here. Absolutely. I think whether you're the governor or you're a sitting member of Congress even, you should be willing to meet the president, greet the president, etc. But at the end of the day, this election is about New Hampshire. Who's going to be the best voice for New Hampshire? A strong voice, an independent voice, willing to work with the president, keep taxes low, pare back regulations, keep the country safe and secure. And he focused on the economy in that State of the Union, which was great to see because we have so much work left to do.
Let's talk about the economy a little bit and the Supreme Court decision on tariffs, declaring the IEEPA tariffs unconstitutional. Do you agree with that ruling?
Look, I think the piece of the statute that the court was looking at didn't use the word taxes or tariffs anywhere in it. So it's pretty easy to understand how the court ruled, why the court ruled. The fact is, there are other sections of that law, several other sections, that do give the president ability to impose tariffs. I think what's important here is certainty and clarity. I came out of the small business community in Manchester, manufacturing community. I worked for small companies, medium-sized companies, large companies. What they want is clarity and certainty. And then have the government get out of the way, let them innovate, let their employees work and produce and grow, right? That's what we need, clarity and certainty. So I think it's incumbent on the president and on Congress to step up, to clarify where we're headed. If we're going to have tariffs, set them at a reasonable rate. I mean, when you're dealing with a country like China, I completely understand what he's trying to accomplish and to, restrict their access to American markets, American technology, et cetera. But give us some clarity and certainty, and Congress has a big role to play as well.
The money the federal government gathered from these tariffs, if it has to be refunded, should it go to the businesses or to the consumers?
I don't have a legal answer to that question. It should go to whoever paid it. It should be done in a simple, clear, effective way. It is a bit of a mess. There's no question about that. But I think given today's computerized systems, the way it was paid, there ought to be a pretty straightforward way to pay it back if the courts decide that that's what needs to be done.
I think, the USA Today was saying about $1,000 to $1,700 for the average American family in added costs from tariffs in 2025. If Washington doesn't give that money back to we the people,
sure,
man, that seems like a bad decision.
And again, this is what Congress should take a look at, right? Congress has a role to play here. They passed all of this legislation that gave power to the president. They certainly have the ability not only just to codify things more clearly, but to make a decision about returning it to the American people.
Let's talk about this saga involving the ICE facility in Merrimack that never came to be. A lot of sound and fury in the end. The town didn't want it. The opposition was bipartisan. Your primary opponent was here a few weeks ago and essentially declined to take a firm position on this, saying he just didn't have enough information. But if you were in the Senate over these last couple of months dealing with this situation, would you have been standing up to the White House saying you've got to find another location here?
Well, I did take a position, in fact, a couple of weeks ago. I mean, you shouldn't be afraid to be clear on something like this. I think what was missing was coordination and communication with the local officials, with the city or town. And whether it's the federal government or a big manufacturing firm wanting to put in a new facility, you've got to work with local officials. You have to keep them informed. They didn't even do a good job of informing the governor. And that's why she stepped up, weighed in with Washington, and ultimately said, look, given the failure to communicate effectively, given the failure to work with local officials, you ought to put a pause on this. And they listened. And that only underscores for me the importance of having an advocate, a voice in Washington, in the U.S. Senate that will be listened to, that will be effective, and that will have an impact. I know I'll be that person.
Back to the economy, a lot of the prognosticators right now are looking at artificial intelligence and saying there could be a lot of disruption in the labor market, more than just the usual creative destruction of capitalism. We could see a lot of job loss. What kind of government intervention, if any, is appropriate to try to help people if we do see tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of jobs lost?
The only thing worse than people in the tech industry making wild speculations about what AI is going to do in 5 years or 10 years is some politician in Washington speculating about what's going to happen in 5 or 10 years. So we need to be very clear about that. Whatever Washington does in terms of regulation in the near term should be light touch, setting up a regulatory framework, protecting privacy, copyright, intellectual property, things like that. So we need to move very slowly, and we should never leap forward based on wild speculation. Second, the way I look at this, AI is a tool, and it can be disruptive, no question, but disruptive not unlike the way that the automotive technology was disruptive. Computer technology was disruptive. Internet technology disruptive. All of these things, though, increased productivity, helped grow the economy. And frankly, I don't think AI is going to be any different. Your question, though, is, well, what if there's a significant disruption in employment? If unemployment, spikes, it goes from, it's 4.3% right now. How high does it have to go before the government, Congress takes action? 6%, 8%, perhaps. We've done things like this before. Retraining programs, job retraining, even things akin to what was done during the pandemic. I don't expect disruptions, anything like what we saw in the pandemic. So I think it's much too early to talk about that kind of assistance or aid. But, I talk about retraining. We have dozens of training and education programs for workers in the federal government. And the fact is, some of them don't work very well. And New Hampshire doesn't control the funding the way it should. One of the things I've talked about consistently is programs like that, job retraining, job investment, let New Hampshire control the funds without the strings from Washington. We would be far better off. And if there's any disruption, New Hampshire should lead the way in helping those workers get back to the job.
Before we wrap up here, I do want to ask you about the situation with the Epstein files. The name John Sununu ended up in there with Mr. Epstein saying something to the effect of John Sununu has good stories. What was your reaction when that came out?
I was obviously pretty stunned. I never communicated or met him. My father's never communicated or met him. Obviously a despicable person.
You're going to face attacks on this, though, I guess. How do you respond when the super PACs come in and just pound you on this?
I've never met him. I've never communicated with him. There's no evidence to indicate or to show that anywhere, whether it was in those records or files or anywhere else.
You know, given the fact that these questions that you have to face now, that the attacks have already started, do you think Congress did the right thing by releasing all of these files?
I think they did. Sure. Look, if it was the will of Congress to have it done, better to have more transparency rather than less. The key, though, is in a situation like this, you protect the victims, you protect people's privacy. And, you know, I think DOJ probably could have done a slightly better job in that in terms of looking out for the victims. But what's done is done, and the country moves forward.
All right, Senator Sununu, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right, and we'll be right back with Democratic candidate for governor, Cindy Warmington. Stay with us.